Hello and welcome. In my latest call for questions, I received a couple of great queries about the relationship between the United States and Britain. So, McSwordfish asks, is the US-UK special relationship real? Was it ever real? I remember it being spoken about a lot during the Blair Bush years. Was there ever anything special about it, or was it always just a propaganda phrase used by successive British governments to explain cozying up to the USA rather than the rest of Europe? So thanks so much for a really, really great question. I think when we think about the United States and Britain, I mean, this is a really, really complex question because obviously, British policymakers, and it's almost always British policymakers, will refer to this special relationship and they'll talk about how it means so much and that somehow there's this sort of unique partnership that exists between Britain and the United States. But American policymakers don't seem to talk about it in the same way. You don't hear them sort of referring this whole time to the special relationship. And so it sort of gives this sort of sense that this is something that really exists in the mind of the United Kingdom rather than the United States. And I think there is an element of truth to it. But also, I think that it is a bit more complex than that. And I think that there is something about the relationship between the United States and Britain which is very different from many other relationships you'll see between countries in international relations. And I think it's worth actually taking a step back into history and sort of thinking a little bit about how this emerged, because of course, it won't come as a surprise to anyone that, the United States obviously emerged from Britain, from British colonial rule and the establishment of those colonies on the east coast of the United States and their decision to break away, and obviously the very difficult relationship that had. And remembering, of course, that, there aren't a lot of countries that the United States has declared war on in its history, but Britain is actually one of them. United States declared war in 1812 on Britain. So it has been to war with the UK officially. But I think what was very interesting is that relatively soon after that, relations normalized between the two and actually started to become very strong. And funnily enough, one of the key elements of that was to do with developments in the Americas and the end of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, which actually Britain and the United States took a very similar position on. In fact, took the same position on and worked closely with it. Now, one could argue that this was an example of sort of realpolitik at play, 19th century realpolitik at play. The United States obviously was already starting to see the Western Hemisphere as its area of influence. So we had the Monroe Doctrine that emerged from it. And I think Britain at the same time, I mean, it had spent centuries as a sort of seeing Spain as its big sort of colonial opposition. And so this was the chance to sort of end that Spanish Empire in the Americas. So there might have well been that sort of element of sort of working together on it. But it was very telling that they formed a very close relationship. But we'd seen that it would ebb and flow over the past 200 years, that there have been moments when the relationship has been very, very good, but there have also been times when it's very bad. So, for example, Britain was a little bit more equivocal on the US Civil War than the US government wanted. Then, of course, towards the end of the 19th century, you had the United States starting to rise up and become much more influential. And it would take on Britain in certain selective places. So a really interesting example for anyone who doesn't know, and it's really worth taking a little look at, is the question of Hawaii, which was an independent kingdom and actually was looking towards Britain for support against sort of US expansionism. And that ultimately failed, and the United States expanded and seized control of Hawaii. And that explains why, for anyone who's interested, Hawaii's flag actually has the Union flag, the British Union flag in it. So it was actually sort of quite interesting that you would see elements of imperial competition between Britain and the United States in the late 19th century. Then, of course, in the 20th century, you had the First and the Second World War. Many in Britain felt disappointed that the United States didn't enter as soon as it could and should have. And then, of course, Suez in 1956, which in many ways marked the final end of Imperial Britain and the clear dominance, at least within the West, of the United States. And that was a campaign where Britain and France had teamed up with Israel to invade Egypt, to seize hold of the Suez Canal. And the US President Eisenhower was fiercely opposed to this and saw this as an extremely dangerous move. This could upset the Cold War. It could give the Soviet Union leverage in the Middle East. And he pushed back very heavily against Britain and France. And this was a moment of utter humiliation for Britain. And in many ways really marked the break, at least in British minds, between, Britain as a great imperial power and Britain as a post-imperial middle states, with remnants of that great imperial power, such as the permanent seat at the United Nations. So it hasn't always been entirely smooth, this relationship. And I think we need to recognise that. But on the other hand, there are quite clearly elements that bring the two countries close together. I mean, there is a shared history that many in the United States trace their ancestry back to Britain. There's obviously the language element, which shouldn't be underestimated. This is incredibly important. It does mean that there is this sort of common language, although, that has also been overplayed at times. But it does mean that there is easy communication that exists, which, as I say, I think is important in all of this. And I think in many ways, much of the thinking has been very similar. The legal systems are similar. All of this means that there's a lot of commonality there that makes it very easy, I think, in many ways for British to understand America and America to understand Britain. Not entirely, we can see where differences exist, but I think that there is a commonality which has been quite important in that relationship, even if at times that relationship has been strained. But certainly, so, where we stand today, I think what's been really interesting is that in the past several decades, this special relationship has become steadily less important. Now, some would say, well, that's because of the legacy of the Second World War disappearing. George H.W. Bush, as George Bush Sr., had fought in the Second World War and was sort of seen as maybe that last of that generation who had that sort of close tie to Europe and to the United Kingdom. And since then, it has obviously been very different. So many would talk about Barack Obama, that, he had a very different history behind him, and that, with his Kenyan ancestry, and Britain had a very difficult process of decolonization from Kenya, which left a lasting impact. Maybe that had also affected his views. In the case of Biden and certain other US presidents, John Kennedy, for example, there was an Irish ancestry, and we know that there was sort of an element of the antagonism between Britain and Ireland that would sort of come into the thinking sometimes. But I think essentially what we've seen is sort of essentially a close relationship persist. Trump has been especially interesting, I think, in all sorts of reasons, because Trump quite clearly sees his British ancestry as an important part of his identity. The fact that he set up these golf courses in Scotland, where his mother came from, the fact that he is quite clearly an ardent royalist, for better or for worse, and that, it was felt that Queen Elizabeth and King Charles could somehow get through to him in ways that others couldn't, I think has been terribly interesting in all of this. So I think Trump in many ways is much more pro-British. But on the other hand, you also see the fact that he's got very little sentimentality there when it comes to hard-nosed business. So, the United Kingdom did not get let off from his tariffs. They might not have been as tough as on some other countries, but he certainly wasn't, he wasn't going to give a pass and say, well, look, land of my mother and the rest of it, and I love Scotland and set up golf courses and love going there. I'm not going to impose tariffs. No, there was none of that. So I think it has been really interesting. But of course, we also see the way that the two countries cooperate on things like defence, intelligence, security. Again, this has been called into question because of Trump, because even though at a performative level he might sort of like to sort of have those ties with Britain, it doesn't follow through that he's carrying it carrying it through in real terms of policy. And, we've seen this in several ways. So, for example, there's been talk of, the United States, the FBI had an important office at its embassy in London, which was dealing with certain sensitive matters. The United Kingdom asked that this wasn't shut down, in amongst all the cuts that were taking place, and it was shut down. So in that sense, there is, I think, a feeling in certain parts in the United Kingdom that the United States just isn't as reliable. And obviously we're seeing many in Europe feel this way. But I think that there is this sort of sense of what does this special relationship mean in real terms. So I think, all this is to say, look, it's extremely complex. There's no doubt about it. We know that relations and international relations are complex, that different countries have a whole weight of history behind them. I think it's no difference between the United Kingdom and the United States. But can we really speak of a special relationship? Probably to an extent, but not nearly as much as I think British policymakers would like to think it exists, or would like to present the view that it exists. I think, this has always been something in Britain. It's sort of this way of Britain sort of saying, we are important in world affairs because we are a mediating influence with the United States. And I think, just to end on this, one thing that has, I think, been tremendously damaging in that is Brexit. Now, regular viewers will know what I think about Brexit and what a disaster it was. But I think that this was a really clear area where it has been extremely difficult and damaging for the United Kingdom. And it wasn't as though Britain wasn't told this. Obama did say that Brexit would have an effect on United States as well as for Britain and Europe. And, people at the time sort of said, no, he mustn't get involved in British politics, especially on those who were supporting Brexit. Funnily enough, those who were quite happy to have Trump doing all sorts of things in British politics. But no, they were opposed when Barack Obama said this. But he made a very good point that I always felt that, where Britain's real value lay to the United States was being a US sympathetic, if not voice, in European decision making. That when Europe got together to discuss whatever it might have been, trade, security, that the United States could rely on Britain not to slavishly follow its policies, but at least make sure that its views were represented in the room. And of course, when Britain left the European Union, the United States was removed and it had to go to other partners. And so I think Britain made itself far less significant to the United States through that move of Brexit. One of many of the harmful effects it's had on Britain's standing and its economy, and one that, still won't be acknowledged by the vast majority of people who were trying to persuade the British people to leave the European Union, successfully trying to persuade the British people to leave. But I think, as I say, so that has also had an effect on all of this. So wrapping it up, special relationship, probably more in the minds of policymakers in Britain than in the United States, certainly more in the minds of policymakers in Britain and the United States. Not nearly as important as people feel, but can't be completely discounted. Tied to the last question, Pontimina 4173 asks, Israel has AIPAC to bend US foreign policy towards Israeli interests. Would it make sense for Britain to set up a BritPAC to bend US policy towards British interests? Would such a thing work? Look, so this is really, really interesting, and sort of tying in with the previous question about this sort of the nature of the special relationship. I don't think that this would work. I think for all sorts of reasons. So I think in the case of Israel's relationship with the United States, which, like Britain, it hasn't been quite as smooth as people often imagine. I mean, I spoke already about the Suez crisis. That also played out, by the way, with Israel, that the United States pushed back against Israel. And even though the United States supported the creation of Israel, the relationship really didn't start to emerge as we know it today until the 1960s. So it hasn't been quite as smooth as people often imagine. That from day one, the United States was, this vociferous supporter of Israel in quite the same way that people might imagine. But I think that it sort of rather depends on the fact that Israel is very much a cause that the United States sees this. There are obviously links because there is a large Jewish community in the United States, which obviously supports Israel and has channeled support towards it and has been a very cohesive lobby in the United States for that cause, which I think has been very interesting. But nevertheless, it's very much a sense that Israel is surrounded by enemies. It's a liberal democracy, that it's, economically successful, that this is something that the United States should support. And I think a lot of, and because support of traditionally of many of, the Jewish community towards a politician would rely on that politician's position on Israel, then it actually became very costly in US politics to speak out against Israel. I think, what's very interesting is there are signs that that is now changing, but traditionally it wasn't the way. I don't think that ever really existed in the same way in the United States with Britain. I don't think, for a start, there wasn't that existential element. There wasn't that sense of, if we don't support Britain, Britain is just going to disappear. It's going to be attacked by all its neighbours, and that's going to be the end of it. We need to, our heritage is British, we speak English, we need to defend, this country from which the United States ultimately emerged. That just doesn't exist. I think the other element that's really interesting in all of this is that, there is a very large Irish-American community. And I think one of the things that really has been tremendously positive in my lifetime is seeing the relationship and the situation in Northern Ireland change. But I can well remember when I was growing up certainly in the 1980s, that, there was a very, very high degree of support amongst Irish Americans for the IRA. The IRA, through its political wing, Sinn Féin, would often raise money in the United States. There were a lot of Irish American politicians who would speak out very strongly. So there wasn't that, I think that there was also baked into the US polity, there was a certain, while the country tended to be more pro-British, not entirely, as I'd sort of mentioned in the previous question, I don't think that there was quite that same sort of unanimous support for it that there was for support for Israel, essentially, across the US body politic. So I think for all these reasons, while, the idea of a BritPAC that could lobby for Britain, might be interesting, I just don't see that it would get the traction. I don't think there's enough people in America who identify strongly with Britain. A large amount of Americans clearly have British roots. That's no doubt about it. And, it's sort of... for anyone who's ever done something like 23andMe, if you're British, you will be forever getting pings that it's just uncovered a new relative in somewhere in the United States. So you can see there are quite clearly very strong links that still exist between the two countries in that regard. But I don't think it's an animating force for those people. I don't think that somebody who is British American, not that one ever uses that term in the way that you use Irish American or Jewish American or Black American. These are clearly identifiable groups that you don't have in the same way with British. I just don't think that you're going to get that sort of motivating factor that you're going to say to these people, look, you have to really go out there and fight for British interests in the United States. Just doesn't seem to sort of get the traction. So I think, while certainly Britain does a lot of lobbying in the United States, and, the embassy will be very busy sort of making sure that it's in touch with members of Congress, that, will try and have as best relations as they possibly can with the administration. I just don't think that sort of creating some sort of body that would further those interests would get terribly far. But of course, if anyone feels differently, do let me know in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear any thoughts on that, especially from American viewers. I hope you found that interesting. If so, please don't forget to give it a like and perhaps subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. As always, thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.